up, guys? Otterpop here. Alright, I'm about to do a video. I'm about to do a forensic video, which is probably a long time that I've actually done one of those since, it is my major and it is one of my interests. You'd think I'd be doing more videos and maybe some blog posts on this, but that's okay. I'm doing one now. I'm actually about to be doing a video I've been meaning to do for a little bit about something that some people may have heard of called the CSI Effect, which I personally think is very important. So before I get too far into it, I'm going to preface with a story about how I became interested in forensics in the first place and why I chose to major in forensic science to begin with. I took 4 years in college just to become, or just to have a bachelor's degree in forensic science specifically. Not just science, but forensic science. Why did I choose that? Well, I honestly think the CSI Effect was a big part of that. So in case anybody doesn't know, the CSI Effect is this phenomenon where the portrayal of exaggerated forensics in fictional shows influences public perception. Now, whether or not the CSI Effect exists is up for debate, and whether or not those effects are good or bad is also up for debate. But there have been plenty of people that have done research on it. Some research pointing to, yes, the CSI Effect does exist. Other research pointing to the idea that, no, it really doesn't exist. Personally, I fall on the side of yes. I do think that the CSI Effect does exist, and I think that in terms of the effects that it can have on public perception, I think they can be positive and negative, but I'm going to get into that a little bit later. I will be honest in saying that the catalyst for my interest in forensic science at all was the crime drama Bones, which, if anybody knows, it's basically about this forensic anthropologist who teams up with an FBI agent, and they have a whole bunch of friends, mostly in the science industry, including a forensic artist, a coroner, a forensic entomologist, a geologist, like stuff like that. But they basically come together and solve crimes in very short periods of time, and the main character, Dr. Brennan, is extremely brilliant but lacks social skills, which I kind of identified with for a while. It's probably why I fell in love with the show, but the show itself kind of made me more interested in reading books about forensics in general. One of my favorites is a book by a guy named Rod Engler, and the book is called Blood Secrets, Chronicles of a Crime Scene Reconstructionist. And it basically it's basically an autobiography, as well as an informational nonfiction piece about how this guy, Rod Engler, started out as a police officer in a time and age where forensics was still kind of new. There were still a lot of issues with forensics. It wasn't quite as advanced as it is nowadays, but over time, Rod Engler kind of rose up in the ranks, went from police officer to narcotics and undercover, and eventually became interested in the analysis of bloodstains, and he basically spearheaded, or he was one of the individuals who spearheaded the field of blood spatter analysis that we have today. It's personally one of my favorite books of all time. I mean that quite legitimately, and I highly recommend it for anybody who's interested. And it doesn't really have a lot of images, and it certainly paints a picture, so it's definitely not for some squeamish people. But if you're on the fence, or if you're not squeamish at all, then I would highly recommend it. It's a fantastic book. I absolutely love it. Yeah, those were definitely some of the catalysts for me even wanting to go into forensic science at all. I fell prey to the CSI Effect. I really believe that. But nowadays, I can't even watch crime dramas. I can't. I mean, Bones still holds a little bit of a special place in my heart because of how I grew up with it, how I identified with the main character so much, but I still love the show, which is probably why I don't want to watch it anymore. But any shows, whether it's Bones, Rizzoli and Isles, and CSI especially, I cannot watch them. Now, if I'm critiquing them, that's a different story. I can do watching them and critique. It's still painful to watch, but back to some, information, is that the CSI Effect, as I mentioned, is a phenomenon. Wow. It's like Nemo trying to say anemone multiple times. The CSI Effect is a phenomenon where the over-exaggerated science in crime dramas affects public perception. It was actually named for the show itself and kind of gained a lot of traction, I guess you could say, in the early 2000s. And it usually, in a lot of studies and the way that a lot of, law enforcement or, prosecutors or defense attorneys or even forensic scientists themselves, it refers to the idea that jurors expect a lot more physical evidence in criminal trials. And I do believe that, maybe 15 years ago when it started really coming out, the CSI effect may have had a lot more effect on individuals. And while I think it might be a little less prevalent nowadays, there still may be some slight effect to it. And I'll be honest, I was a bit naive myself when I first started watching forensic shows, and I knew they were somewhat inaccurate. I didn't know how inaccurate they were, but forensic classes certainly showed me otherwise, and it really opened my eyes. I mean, one class, I was working on an indoor crime scene, searching for evidence and piecing together a crime with a whole bunch of other students and reducing contamination, yada, yada, yada. And I was responsible for lifting fingerprints from various objects that were collected from said crime scene. And I probably lifted close to a dozen fingerprints, but only 2 were actually, viable for comparison. Like, let's just say I had 12, because that seems kind of around the number that I think is correct. I had 12 prints, and 2 of them were full prints that I managed to grab, and I managed to grab enough comparisons to compare them to known prints. And there were maybe 3 that were like partials, so I really couldn't use them, but most of them, they were just terrible. And that's like, after experiencing that firsthand, and this crime scene was created by an instructor who had been in the field for decades. He knew what he was doing. He'd been in the program for a long time. Larry, I love you, but I hate you. It's difficult to explain, but I just wanted to say that. He really was a fantastic teacher. He knew what he was talking about. He knew how to set up these crime scenes, and it was extremely eye-opening. I came to really understand that, even though we did kind of go to mock trial with law students and we presented our evidence as we would in any ordinary case, it was still interesting that, and we were able to actually prosecute an individual with hard evidence, but most real world cases aren't necessarily like that. It took us weeks of, single class periods anyways, to process this scene. Crime scenes don't get solved in the span of 24 or 36 hours. Like, sometimes there may be enough hard evidence that you can solve it within like 2 or 3 days, but most might even take weeks just to solve, and may take months more just to get to trial. It's absolutely insane. It is certainly nothing at all. I mean, or pretty much 90 or 95% of the time, is my estimate anyways, it is 90 to 95% of the time not the same as it is in those CSI episodes. Which, and speaking of, it's kind of part of the CSI effect in general, is kind of part of the reason I want to look at these episodes of CSI and critique them. Like, I imagine at this point people know that the show is very inaccurate, but you never know. There might be some things that you still might not know. I critiqued an episode for one of my classes a long time ago from like the 2nd season or something like that. Maybe the 1st, I don't know. But I found so many errors and mistakes that I could not believe I had picked up on, that I probably wouldn't have picked, like I probably could have picked up on some of them, but I picked up on so many more than I thought I ever could have. And it was incredible. And again, I knew that there were inaccuracies with a lot of those shows. There was still so much, before I got interested in forensics, there was still so much that I did not know. And maybe there are some other things that other people don't know either. So it would be really cool to take the time to, maybe educate people who may or may not know the limits of forensics, and, compare show to reality and give them information about things that they might not have picked up on either. Now, again, I did mention earlier that that I did believe in the CSI effect. I do believe that it does exist. I do believe it was especially eh, wow, prevalent a long time ago, and I think it still may kind of linger a little bit nowadays because the technology is much more advanced than it was even 15 years ago. But at the same point, I think that there are positive and negative effects of the CSI effect. I mean, there are plenty of, potentially bad effects. Some criminals may end up becoming a little bit smarter by watching the shows. You know, not all criminals, of course, because frankly, not all criminals might have access to TV necessarily. It's kind of hard to say, but some criminals might get smarter and do things or use techniques on the shows that they hadn't thought of before that might allow them or that might allow them to get away with it or almost get away with it too. There is also the potential that people will expect more hard evidence when in a lot of crime scene cases, based on my own experiences and based on lectures from my instructors, is not always very easy, but less hard evidence could lead to fewer convictions or could lead to improper convictions. It could, like, the less evidence you have, the more on the fence it could go. Like, people, I think, especially back in the day, expected the flashy technology and the speedy processes that were going on in these shows that simply either didn't exist at the time, and some of which still may not exist today. I mean, I know a huge example is on Bones. One of the individuals is a forensic artist who, in somewhat later seasons, like I want to say fourth, fifth season and later, used this 3D program to like reconstruct faces and whatnot. And while that may kind of be possible, it was not possible at all to the extent that they made it look in the show, which, I figured out probably after a while, but I honestly for a bit did think that was kind of possible. Me and my naive self, because we're all naive when we're younger. I can fully admit to that. I'm still naive in some instances nowadays, but at least now I'm a little bit smarter. Some people may demand that specific tests deliver specific results, or that, tests just deliver results at all, which may not. And sometimes that might result in more tests, more time needed, more resources allocated that may be unnecessary to use up or may not even be possible to use up or complete. I wish I could think of a better way to word that, but that's all I can come up with at the moment, unfortunately. Ah, jeez. So the CSI effect, it may have some potentially bad effects, but there may be some potentially good effects as well. I mean, since the release of CSI, not all, but more forensics programs like the one that I went to at UNL have opened up in, sometimes schools and universities across the country. The greater availability of these programs might lead to greater awareness of what forensics really is and what it's really capable of. And despite the heavy inaccuracies of so many of the shows, and again, CSI in particular, I'm sorry, I'm going to be nagging that show a lot because that's probably one of the worst offenders in terms of scientific inaccuracy. But despite those inaccuracies, some people may actually be getting smarter and might be questioning the methods and the practices and the testing that's present in the shows. And as a result, may have something of a better understanding of how crime scenes work, how laboratory research and testing works, and the like. Nowadays, now that we know a little bit more about the CSI effect, whether it's real or not, it may influence producers who are making crime dramas these days to make maybe slightly more accurate shows, but it may affect, attorneys and law enforcement and, people in the forensic industry to educate others, even ordinary civilians, on the differences between TV and reality. And in some cases, like some attorneys have already done that in court cases, where they might provide simple explanations for what can be done and what was done and what came, like the results that came out of said tests or procedures, things like that. crime scene investigation and forensics, they're not they're not cut and dry. They're not simple. I mean, they may not be as successful as people make them out to be as well. I mean, for one thing, forensics is heavily based on the idea of bias and subjectivity. It's not a defined science necessarily, like, say, physics or chemistry, where we know the reactions, we know how the world works for the most part, we know the equations of science, but forensics isn't necessarily like that, and I think a lot of people might not quite be aware of that. But more interested people are joining the field and becoming more educated on the subject nowadays, at least compared to maybe, say, 20 years ago. And with all the advances in technology, the combination of that and people's awareness rising and people becoming more educated in the subject, whether they want to pursue it as a career or not, could lead forensics to a much more positive path. So I chose forensics, I think in part because of the CSI effect. I also chose forensics because it was interesting, because it doesn't have all the answers. And that may seem like a really weird thing to say, but I like challenges like that where you don't necessarily know everything. Like sometimes the unknown can be a scary thing to think about for some people, but to me, it's almost like an opportunity to learn something new. I mean, me personally, I love learning new things, but perspective is an important thing to have in a field like this, especially an open-minded perspective where you question everything that's going on around you, whether it's in a fictional drama or real life or career or just anything like that. You have to question everything that's going on around you because sometimes you may not know what's real and what's not. At least that's kind of my take on it. And in my perspective, I do think the CSI effect is real. I do think it is. I mean, I can't think of any other reason I might have gotten interested in forensics. I mean, started watching a crime drama, got interested, started reading some books, got even more interested, found there was a program in Lincoln, Nebraska, done. And I completed the program. And I didn't change it at all because I was too fascinated by it. So I definitely think the CSI effect had a major impact on my career choice. But anyways, what's your guys' take? Do you think the CSI effect is real or not? Do you think it's still affecting our society? Maybe it's good or bad, and I mean, maybe you learn a thing or two from this video. Who knows? But anyways, I'm gonna go ahead and leave that there. So thank you all for watching. I am very thankful for any of those who might have stuck all the way through. But thank you very much for watching, and as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters.